Welcome to Trauma Bay. From the beginning, you were afraid. Not just you, but everyone who came before you. Your ancestors stood beneath skies they didn't understand, trembling at the sound of thunder, watching the wind tear through their shelters, unable to make sense of why the rain came sometimes and not others. People were born. People died. Sometimes slowly. Sometimes suddenly. And in the absence of answers, they looked for meaning. Because humans don't tolerate chaos very well. We crave patterns, we crave explanations, even if they're wrong, especially if they make us feel safe. So they told stories. They looked at the sky and saw gods. They looked at fire and saw a gift from the heavens. They watched the sun rise every day and believed it had to mean something. It was comforting to believe the universe was watching, that someone or something was in control. Because otherwise, what was all this for? They didn't have medicine. They didn't have meteorology or biology or physics. They had fear and imagination. So the stories grew, and over time, those stories solidified into beliefs, and beliefs hardened into systems. And those systems began to shape everything, how people lived, how they loved, how they died. That's how religion began. Not from truth, but from trauma. Not from facts, but from fear. You may have been told that religion was born out of divine revelation, but if you look closer, you'll see it was born out of a desperate need to explain the unexplainable. It wasn't handed down. It was built up, layer by layer. By people, not gods. It gave people a sense of control. If the gods were angry, you could make offerings. If your crops failed, it wasn't random. It was punishment. And punishment meant rules. If you followed the rules, you were safe. If you broke them, you weren't. This is the root of obedience. Control came next, because someone had to interpret the will of the gods. Someone had to define the rituals, the laws, the sacrifices. And those someones, priests, prophets, shamans, became powerful. Not because they knew more, but because they claimed to speak on behalf of the unknowable. You can't argue with a man who says he hears the voice of God. You can't challenge authority when that authority claims to be divine. And that's where religion went from belief to structure, from hope to hierarchy, from myth to mechanism. It became a system, one that rewarded compliance and punished dissent, one that offered comfort in exchange for control, one that defined good and evil not based on empathy, but on obedience. Suddenly, morality was no longer about how you treated others. It was about how well you followed the rules. And rules varied wildly. Don't eat this. Don't wear that. Pray this way. At this time. Face this direction. Avoid these people. Kill those people. Not because it made the world better, but because it marked who was inside and who was out. Religion created borders, not just physical ones, but spiritual ones. It decided who belonged, who was pure, who was chosen, and by contrast, who deserved to be hated, silenced, or destroyed. Wars were waged not for land or freedom, but for the truth. People died not because they were evil, but because they were different. And yet, through it all, people held on. Because religion didn't just punish, it also comforted. When your child died, it told you they were in a better place. When your village was burned, it told you it was part of a greater plan. When life felt unfair, it whispered that justice would come later, even if it never came here. And that comfort is powerful, sometimes more powerful than truth. Because when your heart is broken, truth feels cold, logic feels distant, and religion is warm. It holds you, it explains the pain, it gives the suffering a reason. But there's a price. To accept that comfort, you have to stop asking questions. You have to suspend doubt. You have to believe things that, if said in any other context, would sound absurd. You have to accept stories that contradict science, history, and sometimes even your own sense of compassion. You have to close one eye and call it faith. And in doing so, you give up a piece of yourself, not your soul, your sovereignty. Because now, someone else decides what's true. Someone else tells you what's right. Someone else defines your value, your purpose, your afterlife. And you are just a follower. Even when it doesn't feel like control, it is. Even when it feels like love, it can be manipulation. Because if someone tells you that your suffering is noble, you're less likely to rebel. If they tell you that poverty is part of a test, you won't question inequality. If they promise you paradise later, you'll tolerate hell now. Religion works best when people are in pain. It flourishes where there's fear, where there's hunger, where there's desperation. Not because it cures those things, but because it makes them bearable. And when something becomes bearable, people stop trying to change it. That's the hidden cost of comfort. It numbs the outrage. It pacifies the discontent. It replaces revolution with reverence. And through that, systems of power remain unchallenged, because the faithful don't question. They submit. And so, generation after generation, religion passed down. Parents teaching children to believe not because it's true, but because it's tradition. Sacred texts copied and preserved not because they hold wisdom, but because to doubt them would be blasphemy. And blasphemy became the greatest sin, not harming others, but asking forbidden questions. The stories stayed the same, even as the world changed. Women gained rights, but ancient texts still told them to obey. Science advanced, but people still prayed for rain. We mapped the stars, cracked DNA, built machines that landed on the moon, and yet we still kneel before invisible forces, hoping for miracles. You have to ask, why? Why, in a world of such knowledge, do we still cling to superstition? Because it's not just about belief, it's about belonging. Religion gives you a place, a community, an identity. You're not just a person, you're a believer, one of the faithful, one of the chosen. And that sense of purpose, of specialness, is addictive. But it also divides. It says, we are right, and they are wrong. We are saved, and they are lost. We are pure, and they are sinners. That is not unity. That is tribalism in spiritual clothing. And it leads to violence. Holy wars, ethnic cleansings, terrorism, oppression, all in the name of a loving God. How does that happen? Because when you believe you have absolute truth, any dissent becomes dangerous. Any outsider becomes a threat. And suddenly, kindness becomes conditional. Compassion becomes tribal. Morality becomes obedience. But morality isn't obedience. It's empathy. It's understanding. It's seeing yourself in others. And you don't need religion for that. Empathy existed long before commandments. Kindness doesn't need a heaven. Love doesn't require a scripture. You are capable of being good without being watched. You are capable of meaning without mythology. Because the truth is, religion didn't make you human. You made religion. You looked at the stars and told stories. You faced fear and created gods. You wanted answers and you invented them. It wasn't a sin. It was survival. But now you know more. You know what causes lightning. You know how disease spreads. You understand the universe in ways your ancestors couldn't imagine. And yet you still whisper prayers into the void, hoping someone's listening. That's not wrong. It's human. But maybe it's time to grow up. Not to reject all wonder, but to seek real answers. not to mock belief, but to move beyond it. Because just as we outgrew myths about monsters under the bed, we can outgrow myths about invisible judges in the sky. You don't need fear to live morally. You don't need reward to be kind. You don't need punishment to seek justice. What you need is truth, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Because truth, unlike belief, asks something of you. It asks you to think, to question, to grow, to let go of comfort and face reality with open eyes. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most sacred act of all.